China is attractive in the sense that it is seen as a great power which behaves like truly equal power to us. China has built a very solid brand of what it stands for, big brother, south to south cooperation, and it's worked.
In what ways is China's influence in Kenya most apparent?
I would say in two ways. The most important is debt. So over the last decade, Kenya has accumulated about 10 billion US dollars of debt. Out of that, 65 to 70% of that debt is from China. So over the years, Kenya has realized that debt is becoming a problem. And when we had our last election, which brought in a new president, there was a realization that this huge dependency on debt and debt from China specifically needs to change. So one of the big areas in which China has influenced us is because of the huge amounts of debt from China, there has been a very good discussion about where should we be borrowing the money from. In that sense, there's a shift towards more domestic borrowing, at least a wish for more domestic borrowing, even if that's not happening very well. There has been a question of why we went so much into a bilateral debt without some kind of balancing. So that is being corrected by sort of expanding our bilateral sources of debt. And thirdly, in a negative way, of course, the debt has meant that we've now increased a lot of taxation on Kenyans. So Kenyans now can draw a direct link between domestic policy and international policy. So debt has been huge. And out of that debt, a huge part of what Kenya collects, about a third of Kenya's collections, go to repaying of Chinese debt. So that is one of the big ones, debt, and what the effect of that debt is domestically. The other one I would say is imports, which is broadly an African issue where most countries in Africa, Kenya imports 25% of its import from China. So it's risen very skillfully to a very high level. So China is our biggest import market. And by far, the second one is much smaller, which is India. The impact of imports is interesting because it's really not matched by how much we export to China. So we are absolutely very reliant on China and on very key products. So in that way, China has a lot of leverage on Kenya as an importer. And unlike the United States, which actually we do now have a trade balance with, I think we export slightly more to the US than the US exports to Kenya. We have a huge trade imbalance with China. So in summary, I would say the two things is debt and trade and unfavorable trade that Kenya has with China.
What makes China an attractive partner for Kenya?
China has built a very solid brand of what it stands for. So it's this sort of apolitical, big brother, south to south cooperation, that kind of brand. And it's been a very persuasive brand and it's worked. So China is attractive in the sense that it is seen as a great power which behaves like truly equal power to us. Kenya does understand the inequality, how powerful China is, but China is very attractive because of its approach, this apolitical approach. That apolitical approach is what has made China very attractive as a source of capital, so a source of loans, partly because it's not seen as, and this is important, it's not seen as intrusive in terms of its oversight as the United States. Does that mean that its loans are not indeed probably as bad? No. So it's got other issues. Let's say there are other challenges or other issues with its loans, but at least it's built a very good brand of being apolitical. And that being apolitical cuts across, even commercial activities. If it's arms imports, for example, you realize Kenya, like many other African countries, has been increasing its military equipment procurement from China. And that has to do with this idea of China as a non-intrusive, limited or no oversight over how that is used and so on. So that contrasts, of course, very starkly with the approach of the United States, which is seen as overly intrusive, overly oversight-oriented, and so a bit patronizing. So that contrasts very broadly the difference in the two countries' approaches, and I think it's an important challenge for the United States, particularly in how do they rebrand their sort of big brother brand.
How do elite and popular opinions of China differ in Kenya?
I don't know if they actually differ. I think roundly there's a very positive feeling about China. And why I say they don't differ much is because when you look at, for example, what I talked about earlier, the commercial element of China-Kenya relations, a lot of it is driven by ordinary business people. So if you categorize those as non-elite, sort of business class people, the view of China is a very positive one. So if you're thinking clothes, if you're thinking machinery, if you're thinking any sorts of products, the first place they're thinking of is China. So there's a huge understanding of China really as a commercial port where when you go to China, you cannot fail to get anything. So the soft power aspects of China's attractiveness, of course, is very much commercial, but it's there and it's pretty good. And then, of course, at the political level, there's also a very good feeling about China. One is because there's an acceptance of an inevitability about China's rise as a great power, probably the most dominant power in the coming 25 years. So even among the political elite, the top political elite, there's acceptance that China is a country that you can't ignore. You have to pay attention to it. And it offers immense opportunities across board in terms of financing, as we've been doing, but also in terms of technology transfers, in terms of student exchanges, in terms of, it seems ready also to come up with solutions and listen. I don't think the two differ much, the elite and sort of the business, ordinary person's view. The only maybe little negative I would say is it's got a problem. It's become so dominant, that commercially dominant, that presents a problem for the ordinary people. So we had a case a few months back where we got a mall called China Square, which is this shop owned by Chinese, which is selling everything and it's so cheap. And there was a huge national outcry about why they got a license to operate in Nairobi and sell things so cheaply, and in so doing outsell the ordinary person. So I think that is mostly the downside, ordinary person's view of China as this sort of very competitive and dominant player who might come to take away people's jobs and people's livelihood. But otherwise, that was resolved. It's not there in the conversation anymore. So I think loudly quite positive views of China.
Why should Americans pay attention to the China-Kenya relationship?
So I think broadly, the US should really care because China, in some cases, represents a very different vision particularly for global values and global multilateral governance, different from what the US presents. And increasingly, that governance style is one which is more about stability, let's say, than pure democracy. And the question is, how well is that catching on among different African countries? So I think it's something that challenges the US view of their role in democratic enhancements, and therefore Chinese entry into countries such as Kenya, and particularly the involvement of the Chinese Communist Party itself, is something that is increasing, and therefore something that needs at least to be, well, not checked, but monitored in what is the overall vision and what are they thinking, and particularly from the Kenyan side. But I would say that there's a lot of interest from the Kenyan side and a willingness to want to study that model and what China really presents at a global level.
What can the United States do to be a better partner for Kenya?
I think it needs to think seriously about the brand that it presents. So part of the reason why I think China is quite successful is that China has been quite consistent in the brand of diplomacy that it offers or presents and approaches. The US swings a lot, and it's not, of course, it's because of the democratic situation in the US and the presidential elections and changes. So every president brings their own vision. But I think consistency is what would win Kenyans to the US side. We need to understand what the US really stands for. One of the areas that I think the US can really be effective, which is also in line with their vision, is really to help the ordinary Kenyans stamp and stem the wave of corruption and degradation of governance at the point of stealing of public resources. All the money transfers, all the sort of profit shifting if it's corporations. If the US is seen as serious in actually countering, particularly at the political level, countering corruption, I think it can restore a lot of confidence in what the US stands for. And it's something that it's been doing with many other countries, Nigeria and so on. But I think it's at a very small scale that people really don't see the seriousness. So if you really hit hard and caught some big fish who are involved in some not so straight money transfers and business and things like that, that can be effective. Otherwise, I think the US should just stay focused and remain on what they have traditionally done, which is governance, democracy, health. I think they have done really well in health. I think it's a great area that the US is recognized as a leader and really important. Only that in governance, I think the focus needs to be a little bit just beyond the elections. I think it needs to go to aspects of delivery. So what do democratic leaders actually deliver? And that's part of the anti-corruption drive and so on. So if that was to be delivered, I think the US would come out as a very credible influencer in the country and therefore actually win a lot of at least public support for the interventions.
How can the United States and China cooperate to serve the needs of Kenya?
I think it's first, of course, to understand Kenya's interest and see where they can agree on common areas of alignment in the three countries, so US, Kenya, and China. And I think it's not difficult. One of those areas is stability in Kenya and Kenya's regional objectives. So things like fighting terrorism, things like becoming an exporter of peace around the East African region and the Horn of Africa. Kenya wants to be stable, and Kenya doesn't want to be destabilized by the conflicts in the neighboring countries. I think Ethiopia is a bit of a concern. South Sudan, Somalia. So that should not be an area of competition, in my view. I think it's possible for the great powers to align with Kenya to help Kenya bring stability, export peace in these regions. I think one other area would be good actually to have committees at different levels. So, for example, parliamentary committees on US, China, Kenya partnerships. So the point of these kind of committees at a political level would be to engage on what are the issues of common benefit, to monitor their progress, and to highlight those issues. And actually, I think it's really important to highlight that there are many areas of common interest, and partly, maybe particularly among us scholars, we tend to see this as mostly a conflict issue. I mean, a great power competition issue. There is great power competition, but I think there are many aspects of alignment in terms of interests, things like stability, everybody. I mean, I think we all want stability in East Africa. And Kenya has been the hub for that. I think it's important if we approached the Kenya developmental issues from a point of trade balance. I think it's possible to work together to ensure that the two countries, US and China, actually work on that and improve that. So the US is there already. And therefore, I think even though there might be competition for commercial advantages, it's possible also to work it from the Kenyan perspective, which is we would like to increase our exports to the two countries in a way that is proportionate with what you sell to us. I think that is a proposition that can be worked on. And I think this is where China isn't doing enough, in my view. I think they haven't really done much in terms of any kind of preferential investment or trade agreements with Kenya. And I think this could be some of the areas for partnership to ensure that basically the idea here would be developmental. So the best way to develop the country would be through trade. And I think this is something that can be worked on